Hello, and thanks for joining this webinar about the implications of constructive development theory for you in your career and your business. My name is Sean. I'm a freelance business coach and I'm focused on supporting the growth of independents and small businesses. I started my career in technology and I've got around 20 years experience as a business analyst. Much of that time I've been in different financial services firms and I still spend a lot of my time in this space. But a few years ago, I decided that I also wanted to pursue my passion for personal development, so I trained and qualified as a coach. Given my experience in business, it made sense for me to leverage this and focus on businesses in my coaching. And I was particularly drawn to independents and small businesses, I guess partly because my dad was self-employed when I was a kid, but also because I strongly believe that this sector is and will continue to be the economic lifeblood of our country. From little acorns, big oak trees grow, and I want to help those acorns. This is especially true now as we move forward in these highly uncertain times. I've known Dr. Stevens, who you can see at the bottom of this slide, who created constructive development theory for probably around 10 years now. We met through his wife, who was a colleague of mine at HSBC at the time, and we found we had a mutual interest in personal development, and we built up a friendship based around this. This led me to being a participant in one of the research studies for his doctoral thesis, and that was really exciting. But what was more exciting was that Dr. Stevens' thesis proved for the first time that self-awareness can be measured, and that the basis of this measurement can be used to create targeted coaching interventions to improve one's competence in the task of thinking. So what do I hope you'll get from this session? Well, my aim is that you'll come away understanding why dynamic intelligence matters in your career or business, or indeed as a coach or other adult development professional. I want you to understand how it can be measured based on cognitive intentions, and I'll explain what these are shortly, and which specific thinking styles via cognitive intentions have the biggest impact on your level of dynamic intelligence. In order to meet those aims, I've got some specific objectives. I'm going to explain cognitive intentions and how they can be measured using something called the identity compass, explain dynamic intelligence and how it can be measured using the thinking quotient. I'm going to consider why dynamic intelligence is important in your career or your business and why it's important in adult development. Let's start with constructive development theory, or CDT. It was first described by Dr. Stevens of Coventry University in his doctoral thesis. The title of this thesis was, as is often the case, a question. Does constructive development exist as a conceptual measure of self-awareness in the moment? And he answered the question with a resounding yes, describing how self-awareness could be measured using cognitive intentions. So let's start there. But before I do, I want you to answer a question. Thinking back to the last important piece of work you did, how did you know how well you did it? Did you mostly rely on your own judgment, or mostly rely on the feedback from others? Or was it an equal balance of your own judgment and feedback from others? So thinking back to the last important piece of work you did, how did you know how well you did it? Did you mostly rely on your own judgment, or mostly rely on feedback from others, or was it an equal balance of your own judgment and feedback from others? I'll give you a moment to think about that. So what we've done there is very simplistically gauge two of your cognitive intentions, internal and external. Cognitive intentions are shortcuts in our thinking that we've developed since childhood. They're imperfect but practical methods of achieving a thinking outcome. So for people that are more internal, they might have learned early on that their own opinion is actually quite good. So they reinforce this by listening to themselves more and more over time until they pretty much exclusively rely on their own opinion, not really considering what others think. They might call it trusting their own judgment. However, they're unaware that they can't not do it. Alternatively, more external people will have learned over time to assess their behaviour based on the opinions of others and find it difficult or impossible to apply their own judgment. And then, of course, there are those that have learned over time to take a balanced view, tempering their own judgment with feedback from others, which is the pattern that the slide shows. Thinking structures generally come in pairs like this, but they can also contain 3, 4, or even 5 cognitive intentions. And then these are further grouped together in clusters. So we have perception, which is about the way that you perceive the world, motivation factors, or how you're motivated, motivation processing, which is how you process that motivation, and information processing, which is how you process the information that comes in. And there are 50 separate cognitive intentions mapped across the thinking structures and clusters, which are measured by the Identity Compass profiling tool, which was used by Dr. Stevens to develop constructed development theory. If cognitive intentions determine how we respond to our environment, then having an increased awareness of these, combined with our broader intentions or our goals and aspirations, gives us greater choice in how we think, and thus greater choice in our responses. These are the 4 pillars of Dr. Stevens' constructed development theory: intention, awareness, choice, and response. And the level of our ability to choose in the moment is what he terms dynamic intelligence. Of course, simply being aware of our intentions on its own won't necessarily lead to greater choice in our responses. I can be aware that I habitually choose an internal frame of reference, that I prefer to judge the outcomes of what I do by my own internal standards, as we discussed earlier. And I can also be aware that there's an alternative, that I could take into account feedback from others by taking an external frame of reference. However, I may be unable to choose to do that because I'm unaware that this is an option for me personally, or of how to make that choice. To increase our dynamic intelligence, then, we not only need to be aware of the intention, but also aware that we have a choice and of how to exercise that choice by way of a response. To put it another way, the more aware we are moment to moment of our intentions, our awareness, our choices, and our responses, the greater is our dynamic intelligence. Over the last few minutes, you've heard me use the word aware or variations of it an awful lot. And that's because, as you may have guessed, awareness is key. Dynamic intelligence is a measure of self-awareness. And for the first time, as a result of Dr. Stevens' research, it can actually be measured based on how habitually you choose your cognitive intentions. Going back to the Identity Compass profiles then, which of these patterns of cognitive intention use do you think has a higher level of dynamic intelligence? If you thought it was the one on the right, then you're correct. That's because this profile shows greater balance between the intentions within individual thinking structures, meaning that the individual is more aware of these intentions and can more easily choose to use them. Now, Dr. Stevens has called a person's measure of dynamic intelligence their thinking quotient. This is measured on a scale of up to 10, with each level tending towards certain characteristics. Starting at level 5, since that's where we would expect most post-adolescents to start from, we have people whose construction of themselves at any given time is entirely habitual and out of their awareness. They tend to be focused predominantly or exclusively on their own needs, without thinking about the needs or perspectives of others. At level 6, we have people whose construction of self is also largely habitual, or where they are aware of it, they're unable to change it. They tend to be focused predominantly on the needs and perspectives of others. At level 7, we have people, they're still largely focused externally, but they're starting to construct themselves using more balance between their own perspective and the perspectives of others. At level 8, people are far more aware that they can construct themselves according to context and are more able to choose that construction according to the needs of the moment. And people at level 9 have become so adept at being able to choose their construction that their thinking style and thus their personality is at choice. People at level 10 have developed their awareness of construction to such a point that they're capable of seeing the pattern of construction within and beyond the system. But let's be clear, these people don't exist. Level 10 is purely aspirational. And it's important to recognise here that there are no hard delineations between the levels. Constructive development theory, in fact, represents a break away from the stage development paradigm. Each thinking quotient level represents a spectrum, and the stated tendencies within each level are expected to be exhibited to a greater or lesser degree and in different ways, owing to different levels of awareness across different combinations of cognitive intentions. Another way to think about dynamic intelligence is that as our level increases, we're able to access and join more dots. And that's because cognitive intentions don't work in isolation, but together. So if you consider that there are 50 different intentions, then each time you make another one accessible to you, the effect is multiplied by the number of other cognitive intentions that are accessible to you at that moment, because that additional one can work together with any of those others. So let's say that you were highly internal, but as a result of some development work, you're able to choose to be more or less internal or external at will. You can then use this external frame of reference, this additional cognitive intention, with all the other cognitive intentions available to you. So if you're high on the motivation factor influence, you could start to think in terms of what might give you influence from the other person's point of view, which can only make you more effective at influencing, right? If you're high on procedures, that is to say you prefer to be given a way to do things and prefer to just follow the process, you can start to see what impact this bias might be having on others, which might make you appear less bureaucratic or dogmatic and therefore more effective when working with others, and so on across all of the other cognitive intentions. Well, so much for the theory. Why should you or anyone care about this? Well, in 1983, Harvard Business Review published an article that described 5 different stages of small business development. Existence and survival, essentially the startup phases. Growth and takeoff, so the decision to grow and then the success of that decision. And resource maturity, or what we might call steady state. Alongside that, it also identified some key factors necessary for business success and how important each of these was at each business stage. If we take just 3 of these, the owner's ability to do, systems and controls, and strategic planning, and map the type of thinking that is required for each onto them, then the chart here approximates the changes in thinking that are required across the different stages of business development. And what this shows us is that as a business grows, the thinkers of the owners and managers needs to change too. Now, in a relatively predictable and slow changing environment, such as it was in 1983, this can in part be addressed through adequate planning and having the right people in the business according to the needs of each stage. What we've seen in the last few years, though, even before COVID, is that the business environment is becoming consistently more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. No one can predict what's around the corner. Certainly, no one was really predicting COVID, or at least the economic impacts of it. And for many businesses, they had to switch from steady state to survival in really short order. And when you look at what this means for the type of thinking that is required, there are some big changes. Frames of reference had to switch from internal to external. Owners and managers needed to focus on short-term, here and now, concrete details instead of longer-term, bigger picture strategy. And they struggled with that. It's no wonder so many businesses, especially smaller businesses, are really struggling right now. And while we might like to think that 2020 is a blip, it really might not be. As I already mentioned, and what was recognised in a more recent Harvard Business Review article, is that the conditions for accelerating change have been building for years. They include advances in information technology, automation, how we as humans connect with video conferencing and so on, and artificial intelligence, and that's to name just a few. Consequently, an improved ability to both recognise the need to switch thinking and actually be able to do so is essential for business owners and managers in these times. Higher levels of dynamic intelligence have never been so important. So how can constructive development theory help? It's always been possible to use the results of psychometric profiles to target interventions aimed at improving the ability to use a specific cognitive intention to achieve a specific coaching outcome. However, what Dr. Stevens' research has identified is 5 dimensions or groupings of cognitive intention that are correlated with levels of dynamic intelligence. Dimension 1 on the left has the biggest impact on our thinking, with each of the following dimensions having a lesser effect. The most important finding, though, was the disequilibrium of dimension 3 on dimension 1's factors. This demonstrated quantitatively that we do not grow without an aspect of disruption to our thinking. And we can use all of this information in leadership and development coaching contexts, enabling broader development impacts by including a focus on the higher impact dimensions. We think about engaging with an adult development program. We now have an opportunity not only to measure the specific impact of coaching, in other words, answering the question, have we succeeded in making the desired specific changes for thinking and behaviour, but also to measure the broader impact, answering the question, have we succeeded in being truly developmental? Have we achieved vertical development? Now, a note of caution is warranted. It's been noted in previous research within the stage development domain that an individual can drop to a lower stage. Within constructive development theory, this is explained through the concept of a pendulum. An individual, particularly if they're exercising new cognitive intentions as a result of a development intervention, may swing around a temporarily fixed point of dynamic intelligence until they eventually reach a point of no return when their fixed point moves up a level. I can demonstrate this with my own thinking quotient scores over 3 years. In early 2017, my score was 7.06, so my fixed point at that time was probably around 7. Over the following 2 years, either deliberately or accidentally owing to changes in my role, I practiced using other cognitive intentions. And so in early 2019, my TQ score had actually gone down to 6.76. The pendulum had swung backwards. But my latest thinking quotient score from last month, as a result of integrating those practice cognitive intentions so that they were available to me on demand, was 7.76. So my fixed point has probably now moved to around 8. And what this means is that what we are looking for an overall upward trend over time. And this could have implications for the type of longer term relationship required between clients and development professionals. Staying with relationships. Ethically, coaches and other development professionals have a responsibility to ensure they actually deliver what they say they can, and certainly not to cause any harm. In fact, this ethical responsibility is enshrined in the ethics of coaching bodies such as the International Coach Federation and the Association for Coaching. And what constructive development theory shows us is that in a developmental undertaking, the coach or other professional must be at a higher level than the client. They must be what is known as a more complex other. If they're at the same level, then no development is possible, only dialogue, because there is no frame of reference within the coach for a higher level of meaning making. They can't provide the scaffolding to help the client to increase their level of self-awareness. So only dialogue can exist at this level. If the coach is at a lower level, then they may actually cause harm to the client's thinking by bringing them down to their level of thinking. Ethically then, coaches have a responsibility to ensure they are only attempting to develop clients at lower levels of dynamic intelligence than they themselves are at. And it is in the interest of clients that they themselves ensure that this is the case when they engage a coach. It's also worth considering what this means for the manager to employee relationship, particularly as more and more managers are expected to take on a developmental role for the people that they're managing. So to summarise, why does dynamic intelligence matter? Well, it matters because now more than ever, in an increasingly changing world, our thinking needs to be as flexible as possible. But it also matters when we are seeking to develop ourselves or others in order to ensure that we partner ourselves appropriately. How can it be measured? Well, it's measured based on the balance between cognitive intentions. At the moment, the only tool available that allows a measure of dynamic intelligence is the identity compass. What has the biggest impact? Well, there are 5 dimensions or collections of cognitive intentions which have ever increasing impacts on our dynamic intelligence. Focusing on the dimension that will have the biggest impact as appropriate for the individual will have the biggest impact. And of course, having the right development partnership. So I've got some resources for you here. If you wanted to request an identity compass profile, then you can get in touch with me, Sean, at sean.ellis@live.co.uk, or you can find out more about me at seanellis.biz. If you want to find out more about cognitive intentions, there's a book by Arne Maus called Getting People Right. And Dr. Stephen's own book, Thinking Deliberately, is scheduled to be published in early 2021. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this useful.